In this video, we are going to take a look at the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now, in order to really understand what the Missouri Compromise is, we have to take a look at the map and sort of understand where the United States is in the year 1820. So here's a map of the United States. Obviously, it doesn't look like our map today. We were still growing, we were still expanding, and we were still forming as a nation. The original 13 colonies, which were located over here, are no longer alone. Now we've got new states in the north, as well as new states in the south. But we also have territory. We have the Florida territory down here, and we have what was the Louisiana territory over here. And these territories are going to eventually develop into states. But we have a debate going on in 1820 in the United States about slavery. By the time we get to 1820, the nation was pretty much completely divided over slavery. We had 11 free states and 11 slave states, as you can see on the map here. States represented by green are the free states, what we consider the free states. These are states where slavery is not allowed. And then down in the south, we have what's known as the slave states. And if you were to add them all up, it would be 11 to 11. So there's a certain balance that has been able to be maintained through the years, through the early years of the United States, from 1776 till we get to 1820. But there's a problem that starts to develop whenever Missouri decides that it wants to become a state. Missouri is out west, but it's far enough south that crops grow well in Missouri, and slave owners have moved into Missouri, and they've sort of tilted the balance. And so the people in Missouri who want to become a state, they want to allow slavery in their state. But if they do this, it will change the balance between the free and the slave states. And so the slave states will end up with 12 states, which will outnumber the 11 free states. And a lot of people in the North were afraid to give up this power to tilt the balance. And so a lot of people didn't want Missouri to become a state. Some people were against it. And then a guy named Henry Clay comes along. Now, we know a little bit about Henry Clay at this point in history. Henry Clay was very involved in Congress when there were debates going on about the War of 1812. Henry Clay was a hawk. He wanted to go to war with Great Britain. After the War of 1812, Henry Clay becomes a very popular politician, and he has some power within Congress, and he decides he's going to use that power to try to work out a deal. He wants to come up with a compromise. He knows that the reason people are upset about Missouri becoming a state is because it will tilt the balance. But what if another state were to come into the Union at the same time as Missouri, but it were to come in as a free state? Now, the territory that was known as Maine was actually part of Massachusetts, but it never actually developed into a state. Henry Clay had the idea that if Massachusetts would be willing to let go of the territory of Maine and allow it to become a state, then that would keep the balance even at 12 free states versus 12 slave states. And this idea worked. Henry Clay was able to convince members of Congress to go along with his Missouri Compromise of 1820, which would allow Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state and Maine to enter the Union as a free state, which would ultimately maintain that balance of power between the two sections of the country. But the Missouri Compromise would also do one other thing. It would attempt to solve the problem between free and slave states in the future. So an agreement was made that there would be a line drawn at the lower border of Missouri going west. This was called the 3630 Missouri Compromise Line. And the idea was that any states to the south of the line that developed would be open to slavery, and any states to the north of that line would be closed to slavery. Slavery would be not allowed above the 3630 line. And so the compromise did two things. It kept the balance between free and slave states, but it also attempted to settle any issues in the future between the two sections of the country. But as we're going to find out, it'll work for a while, but it won't work forever. And so because Henry Clay is the guy who comes up with the idea for the Missouri Compromise of 1820, he is going to get the nickname of the Great Compromiser. And any time that there's a debate where two sides can't get along going forward, everybody is going to turn to Henry Clay to try to help solve the problem. And as we're going to find out, Henry Clay is actually going to live up to his nickname, because he is going to come up with several compromises that are going to keep the nation together, but eventually slavery is going to lead to the Civil War.